I think we're at that time. We're at start time. So, very warm welcome to everyone for this session this morning with John Pemberton. I don't know if anyone's been to any previous Friends for Life conferences, but John is a regular feature here, and I always take a whole load of golden nuggets to take home, which helps us manage our my son's diabetes. Moments of housekeeping. If you haven't heard me ask, if you could please change your name to the format in the email, that would be fantastic. There is a chat button if you press at the bottom, and you can introduce yourselves. That would be great. And any chat during, by all means, please write down what you'd like to. There's also a question and answers button. If you have any questions for John, please type them in there, and there will be some time at the end of the session, and I'll make sure that we get those questions to John. I'd like to thank our sponsors, and if anyone hasn't visited the virtual booths in the breakout sessions, it's really good if you can do that. So we have quite a few people attending now, so I think we'll get started. I'm going to hand over to John, who's a diabetes educator based in Birmingham. And as I say, he has a whole heap of knowledge, both through his work and also personal experience. So I'm going to hand across to John now.
Cool. Good morning, everybody. Just going to share my screen, make sure we've got this up and running. All right. Cool. We're all good? Okay, so good morning, everyone. This talk is hopefully going to be about 35-40 minutes of me going through what's taken me about 12 years personally and through work to develop, hopefully, all the research into something simple that you can take away when you think about, well, how do I insulin dose for different types of meals? There's a QR code here if you want to scan that with your phone, or if you look in the chat, there's a Google Drive link where you can get this presentation, the insulin dosing guide, the infographics, everything that I go through in here is on that Google Drive. So please use that to gather the information. Okay, we'll get going. So the first thing is, before I start, I've got two kids. I've got a kid who's 1 and I've got a kid who's 3. I just want to talk you through very quickly my 3 guiding principles when I think about their nutrition. This is besides diabetes. This is just good nutrition overall and the way of thinking about things, because I'll keep referring to these as we go through the meal dosing guide. So the first one is my guiding principle when I think about nutrition for our family is it normal or is it natural? So the distinction being, when you look around now, it's completely normal to eat Cocoa Pops for breakfast, completely normal to have white bread sandwich for lunch, completely normal to have chicken nuggets and chips for tea. That is completely normal, and you will not be abnormal if you do that. But our bodies have evolved over millions of years to eat what I call natural food. Essentially things your great-grandmother would recognize. So in this picture, my great-grandmother would recognize fruit, cheese, cauliflower, bananas, etc. She wouldn't know what this is. She wouldn't know what the chips are. She wouldn't know what the pizza is. There's a reason for that, is because the human body's evolved over a long period of time, and it sort of thrives off what's natural, and what's normal now in our usual food environment is a little bit distorted. And that's leading to 50% of adults generally being overweight, and kids are going that way as well. So the first thing I ask for nutrition is a really simple question. Would my great-grandmother recognize it as food? If so, there's a good chance it's a good thing to eat. If she wouldn't, then maybe it's going to have some, not be as advantageous for health. And when we think about diabetes specifically, it's going to be more challenging to match insulin to that. So that's question number 1. And question number 2 as a parent is, do I walk the talk? So if I want my kids to eat healthily and move healthily, do I do that myself? Because essentially I am the best role model for my kids. Monkey see, monkey do. If I do a lot of activity, my kids will. If I eat well, my kids will. So it's just a question that I ask there. And then the third thing is, does my food environment betray my intentions? Everyone's got really good intentions to eat healthily, have your 5 fruit and veg a day, the rest of it. But then when they open the cupboards, if all they've got is packaged food, etc., it's going to make it very difficult if your food environment is not right. This is actually our fridge that I took a picture of yesterday. Most people will think that looks pretty boring, which is probably quite right. But in terms of getting a natural food in, it just makes it easy to make decisions. If my cupboards look like this, I would not be able to resist eating all that stuff. So I just make sure that for our family, our kids aren't. So that's just some guiding principles, and I'll discuss those as we go through. But what you've really come to hear about is mealtime insulin dosing. So how do we make sure we get the right insulin dose at the right time for balanced meals high carb meals, and high fat meals. I'm going to work through each one of these strands one by one to hopefully give you some tips, tricks, and skills to make sure that we get glucose levels not like the top 3 here, but like the bottom 3 here. So we can knock the top off the spikes of the high carb meals. We can get balanced meals almost in target all the time. And for high fat meals, instead of going low first, then really high afterwards, we'll actually be able to get steadier glucose levels. So that's my hope by the end of the next sort of 35 minutes. But we really need to start with, when you take insulin at a meal, what does that insulin actually do? What's it there to cover and how does it work? Most people will understand that when you eat carbs, they get digested to glucose, and the insulin, one of the insulin's job is to come along, pick up the glucose and move it into the cells for energy. The lock and key. Everyone's pretty familiar with that. But there's also 2 other key functions that insulin does. One is it moves the amino acids, which are the breakdown products of protein. It moves those into the cells also, so you can build muscle and regenerate your tissue. Insulin also moves fat from the blood into the cells, so it can be used for insulation and to make sure that the fat cells, the cells stay in good condition. So insulin's not only needed to move glucose across, it's also needed to move protein across and also fat across. And that becomes really important when we start talking about meals that are really high in fat and protein. We really need to think about upping the dose more than just for the carbs. So that's the basic explanation of what insulin does. And it's also important to really think about, well, when I take this dose of insulin, so if I took my dose of insulin at 8 a.m. this morning, what is it working like? So you can see when you first give it, it's peaking at about 1 hour, 90 minutes in. So took it at 8 o'clock in the morning, 9 to half 9, but it continues to work at least for 4 hours, probably 5, but most of it is done by 3 hours. So by 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, most of it is done. It's really important to understand this is sort of how insulin works, how aggressive it is, and then it peters off. Because if you can match how insulin works to how the glucose appears from the food that you've eaten, then you're going to get nice and steady in target glucose levels. If there's a big mismatch to how the glucose appears in the bloodstream from food to the insulin, then you're going to have problems of either going too high or too low. So throughout this presentation, this is sort of what we're referring to when we look at insulin, this triangle here. So how does then this insulin action compare against usual type of meals? So if you've got a balanced meal, things that your grandma would recognize: potatoes, meat and vegetables, egg, toast, and maybe a bit of fruit, shepherd's pie. So you've got some meat, you've got some potatoes, you've got some vegetables, all those things that your grandma would recognize. You can see that the glucose appearance from those type of balanced meals peaks at about 1 hour, 90 minutes, is done a little bit quicker than insulin, but it matches quite well. Therefore, you'll generally tend to get a little glucose rise and it'll come back down. If you have things that your grandma wouldn't recognize: Pop-Tarts, Cocoa Pops, Crunchy Nut Cornflakes, white toast with jam, for example, what you find is that the food gets digested very, very quickly. The glucose appears in the bloodstream very quickly, and it takes a long time for the insulin to catch up. It does catch up, but you spend a lot of time being above 10 millimoles, maybe up to sort of 14, 15. And this is usual after breakfast. This is a typical picture after breakfast, someone who has Cocoa Pops with milk and a slice of toast, for example. And then you've got on the opposite side, you've got anything that generally tastes really good. So you've got fish and chips, pizza, takeaways, McDonald's, etc. They've got a really high fat content. And what you can see is, because of the fat content, the digestion and the glucose appearance in the blood is quite a bit slower. So often, if you give the insulin up front, you tend to go lower or stay okay after eating, but then you get a rocket in the glucose level afterwards. So if you had one of these type of meals last night at, say, 7 p.m, things might have been looking all good by 10, 11 p.m, and then you've woke up in the night and the glucose level's 13, 14, because the glucose is appearing a lot later and it doesn't match the insulin very well. So this gives you an idea of the challenges, and what I want to talk through now is some of the science and some of the tips and tricks so we can make these glucose profiles more in target for these different types of meals. Before we go in this, I just want to say that this is guidance based on the average of the research. So bearing in mind that your young person isn't the average person, it will require a bit of trial and error. And everything that I suggest here is for you to go and discuss with your diabetes team. Big disclaimer, I'm not your dietitian, I'm not your diabetes educator. This is for informational purposes, so you can think about how you want to do things, but check with your diabetes team before doing it, because obviously I don't know your particular circumstances. As we discussed, this is what it looks like for a standard balanced meal. So it might be porridge or egg on toast or meat, potatoes and veg. You generally have a pretty reasonable glucose profile afterwards, but you can still improve this. So how can you improve it? Well, the first thing is your carb counting accuracy. It doesn't have to be within the gram, but it certainly has to be within 10 grams. And why I say that is some of the research here is that what they did is they gave a standard amount of insulin for a 60-gram meal. And I'm going to call that the person had a carb ratio of 1 to 10, so 6 units of insulin. And they gave the 6 units of insulin when they gave different types of meals: 40-gram meal, 50-gram meal, 60-gram meal, 70-gram meal, 80-gram meal. And what you can see is when the carb counting was out by 20 grams, i.e. they only ate 40 grams, but they give 6 units worth of insulin, they went low. When they only gave 6 units of insulin, but ate 80 grams of carbs, they went high. But if you get the accuracy within 10 grams, generally things will be okay. So you don't have to get it within 1 gram, but it certainly needs to be within 10. And the second thing is making sure you get your insulin in 15 to 20 minutes before you eat. This is just a classic slide to show the same meal eaten by a group of people. The insulin given at or after eating, the glucose level goes from 9 to 14, 15, and eventually back down. So the insulin dose is correct. You don't need more insulin. But if you gave the insulin 20 minutes before eating, you will see then it only rises by 1 or 2 millimoles. So being really diligent with your insulin dosing time before meals is really important. And we'll discuss some of the times where you might want to consider not to do that at the end, such as if your glucose level was 4.1 before, or you've got a really fussy eater, for example. We'll talk about those things at the end. If you do those things for balanced meals, you give the insulin 20 minutes before. You can see here you give the insulin a head start. It matches the glucose absorption better, and you end up with a profile that looks a lot steadier after eating just by making sure you're giving that insulin 20 minutes before. High carb meals. So again, these are generally the type of meals that are processed foods: cereal, toast with jam, not necessarily jacket potato with beans, super noodles, waffles, hoops, cereal bars, biscuits. All of these have taken a fair bit of processing before they get to you. Therefore, the carbs are more readily absorbed. Therefore, you usually see a spike in the glucose level after eating, even if you give the right insulin dose, and it often takes a couple of hours to come back down. Like I said, that's a typical breakfast spike. So how can you improve this if you're going to have this type of meal? Well, the first thing you can do is think about changing the type of carb that you're going to have to one that's absorbed a little bit slower. So the fancy word for this is glycemic index. All it means is how quickly from when you eat this type of carb food does it go in through your mouth and get digested into glucose. So you can see cornflakes gets digested super quick and would belong in this one here, whereas your all bran is a lot slower, because it's not very little processing goes through here. Very similar, white bread compared to granary bread. Again, you're talking a difference here. Mashed potato versus basmati rice, for example. Again, you would see the difference. By sometimes just changing your carb source or making it less unprocessed, you will find that the glucose spike after eating is not as large. The next thing you need to do is be super on it with how your before meal bolusing. If you're going to have breakfast cereal, you need to be giving that insulin 20 minutes before, otherwise you're going to be in trouble. Another couple of things you can do when you do this is make sure you get 10 minutes of activity in after eating. So if the difference between someone who walks to school or gets a lift to school is massive in the post-breakfast spike. People who walk to school, they give their insulin, they have their cereal, for example. When they have that walk, it spreads the insulin around the body very quickly. It makes it work much more quickly. Therefore, you don't get a spike. People who get a lift, sit on the backside in the car, get to school, sit on the backside at home, at school. Therefore, they get the big spike because it takes a lot longer for that insulin to get passed around the body. So giving the insulin before is key. If you do a couple of those things, for high carb meals, instead of going up to the 12s and 14s, you'll only go up to maybe the 10s. You're still never going to achieve a flatter line with high carb meals. It's just not going to be possible because the food still gets absorbed much quicker, but you can make it better by choosing lower GI sources, making sure the insulin is definitely 20 minutes before and 10 minutes of activity after eating. High fat meals. So Saturday night, there's a fair chance that people watching this have had one of these meals last night. So fish and chips, pizza, might have gone out to McDonald's, cheesy pasta, things that are basically a lot higher in fat than you usually have. What we find is when you do that, first of all, the fat that's in the meal really slows down how quickly the meal leaves the stomach. And the best way to think about this is the Christmas Day test. So, or whatever your religious festival is, on that day, you go for it. You have loads of food that's usually much higher in fat than you normally have. And when you go to bed at night, you can feel it sitting on your stomach. It feels horrible. And you wake up in the morning and you burp and you can still taste your food. That means it's still sat in your stomach and it's not actually been digested yet. And that becomes a problem with matching insulin to that type of meal because a lot of the carbs are still sat in your stomach, but yet you've given all the insulin. So you end up with this problem with the insulin working too quickly and you might go low first. There's no insulin around after 4 hours. The rest of the meal leaves the stomach and bang, you end up with a really high glucose level overnight. Mixed in with that, if you have the type of meal that is really high in protein, so let's say you also go for this pizza, which is the meat feast. It's got pepperami, salami, chicken, all the tasty stuff on there. You've also got more protein than your body needs to build and repair. And when you do that, the extra protein that's not used for build and repair is turned into glucose by the liver and pushed out. So that's another reason why really high protein added into a high fat meal will cause you to go higher afterwards. And the final reason is when you have a really high fat level in the blood from one of these tasty high fat meals, the fat in the blood actually makes the insulin not work as well at the cell level, what we call insulin resistance. So it's almost like you need 2 keys rather than 1 to open up the cell doors. So you can see when you have these type of high fat meals, especially if they're high protein as well, the insulin dose that you're going to require to overcome this type of meal is going to be much more than just counting the carbs. So what does the research say? If we take adding just extra fat alone, they did a study where they give I want to say it's about 25 kids in Australia, a group in Sydney. They brought 25 kids in on 4 days. Day 1, they gave them just 2 slices of bread, which is the blue line. Typically, as you'd expect, the glucose level went a bit higher by 4 or 5 millimoles after 90 minutes, but then came back down to target. 20 grams of fat added by putting 1 avocado onto 2 slices of bread. You're now looking at the red line. Didn't go as high because the fat slows things down, and the insulin dose came back down. 40 grams of fat, 2 small avocados on the toast, the purple line. Again, you got a much better profile. But then when you went really high fat, stuck 3 avocados on, you can see that the glucose level didn't go as high initially, but stayed high afterwards and would have required more insulin to overcome. On average, the people who were on the 60-gram fat meal needed 20% more insulin than they did do when they had only a small amount of fat or no fat at all. So that just shows you when you add fat more than you usually have, you're going to need to increase the insulin dose to overcome that. But you're also going to need to, rather than give all the insulin up front, spread it out a little bit so there's more insulin hanging around after the 5 or 6 hour mark to bring this glucose level down. And in this study, it was that they needed 60% of the insulin up front and 40% of the insulin spread out over a couple of hours, for example. My favorite study is basically the pizza study, because everyone with diabetes knows that pizza is a shocker because it always makes you go high and stay high for ages afterwards. And this is just proof of that. So this was done on 10 adults, and they brought them in on day 1 and they gave them just basically a pizza base that was 50 grams worth of carbs with a little bit of tomato puree on it. And then they gave them, they were actually on a insulin pump with a CGM that actually, as the CGM rose, the insulin pump gave more insulin, and they worked out the insulin dose that was required for just a pizza base on its own. So that was the green line, so you can see that there. And then they gave the same amount of insulin for a pizza on the second day, which was 50 grams carbs, but this time was a tasty one with all the salami and everything on, loads of cheese. And they gave the same dose, but what happened when they gave the same dose is they went really high. So what they did on the third day is they gave them the really tasty pizza again, but they let the algorithm work out how much extra insulin would be needed to manage this pizza. And on average, 65% extra insulin was needed to cover a pizza. So let's put that into real terms. If on day one, the person needed 10 units of insulin to cover that pizza base, they needed 16.5 units of insulin to manage the pizza. But that was on average. That varied from the person who needed the least 17% extra, so they would have only needed 11.7 units of insulin, but one person suddenly needed 124% extra, so they would have needed 22.4 units to cover what would normally be a 10-unit bolus. So when I talk about this in a minute, when I make some suggestions on where to start of how much extra to have, bear in mind 25% is a small amount extra to add for these type of meals. And you wouldn't want to give all this insulin up front. Ideally, something around 30 to 40% up front, 60 to 70% over the next hour or two. Okay. So you've got one here that says do it 60-40, one here that says do it 30-70. So what we teach at Birmingham is something a bit simpler in the middle is let's start somewhere that's safe. Let's start somewhere that's easy to do, and then let's develop it based on our personal experience. So we say for these type of meals that we know are higher in fat, English breakfast, fish and chips, Indian takeaway, pizza, for example, we say, right, work out the dose, add 25% on. If you're on a pump, 50% up front, 50% over 2 hours. If you're on injections, 50% up front, 50% an hour after eating. Then let's see how it goes. If you still go really high, then next time maybe try 50% extra. If you still go high after that, maybe the time after that try 75% extra. We've got a lot of kids who have, when they have a pizza, they need 100% extra insulin. They need to double the insulin dose and spread it 50-50. So 25% is a safe place to start. Bearing in mind the average pizza that's tasty is going to require at least 50% extra. Putting this into example for you, Jim's having a pepperoni pizza, 80 grams of carbs, would be 8 units for the pizza. Increase it by 25%, becomes 10 units. If it's a pump, 5 units up front, 5 units over 2 hours. If you're on injections, 5 units before, 5 units an hour after. Obviously, we've got a booklet that's on the Google Drive that I talked about, which talks you through exactly how to do this. So hopefully that gives you a rundown of what you can do for high carb, balanced meals, and low fat meals, high fat meals. And these are just some examples for you. I'm not going to walk through these verbatim, but basically the balanced meals in the middle that will just work well with a standard bolus 15 to 20 minutes before are generally all the meals that your grandma would recognize. The meals that are high carbs, you probably wouldn't recognize these because they're very processed, but at least you know what they are and how you could make them more balanced. And obviously here on the higher fat side, you're going to require extra insulin spread out over a long period of time. Now, bear in mind with the high fat, with carb meals, if you're having to increase the insulin dose by 25 or 50%, remember that insulin is a storage hormone. So all that extra insulin is going to be storing all that extra calories as fat rather than burning it as you go. So it's not to say that you should never have these foods, but if you're having to do this extra insulin spread over time, 6-7 days a week, it's probably telling you that you're having the type of meals which are going to lead to extra fat storage over time. I'll put some examples in here for you for lunches, what would be high carb, balanced and high fat. Again, your grandma would probably recognize most of the balanced ones in here. Probably unlikely to recognize the high carb ones here. And I don't think my great grandma ever had burger, chips and crisps from what she told me anyway when she was around. Similarly with evening meals, I'm not going to go over these, as I said, verbatim, but you get the idea. The more vegetables, if you've got a source of protein, a source of carbs and a source of vegetables in your meal, you can bet insulin's going to match that pretty well. You keep it as simple as that. Again, for snacks, what matches insulin better, nut-based bars, toast with peanut butter, fruit with normal yogurt rather than low-fat yogurt, because low-fat yogurt has the fat taken out, therefore get it absorbed quicker. So I've put those in there so you can peruse those in your time to think about some simple choices that you could consider. What about low carbers? So I'm sure we've got some low carbers or some people thinking about low carb, so I thought it's important to cover that off. So let's do the science bit first. Pretty much a low carb meal will be something that's less than 15 grams carbs at a mealtime. Therefore, if you only count the carbs in that meal and apply your carb ratio, it's not going to be enough insulin. So the suggestion of somewhere to start is you would also need to count the protein grams in your meal, divide it by 4, and use your carb ratio. Why do I say, oh, and you wouldn't want to give all the insulin up front. You'd want to extend it for an hour on a pump, or if you'll get injections, give the insulin after a meal. Why do I say that? Basically, you've got a problem of mismatch. So here in the blue is our insulin dose. If you give that at or before eating, the insulin will be working much quicker than the glucose appearance from the meal. Therefore, you will go low first and there'll be no insulin hanging around afterwards. And by the way, each one of these glucose profiles that I'm showing are from a person with diabetes who eats this type of meal and made this mistake. So we've got a problem of a mismatch. So what can we do? Well, we know that the high fat, as I described before, is going to slow down how quickly the food gets absorbed. So we need to think about doing that extended bolus or giving the insulin after eating if you're on injections. We've also discussed if the meal is quite high in protein, so if you're a low carb who's at a low carb, high protein diet, like a Dr. Bernstein style, then the excess protein or the extra protein will actually send a message to your pancreas that will push glucagon out of your pancreas, that will go to your liver and push glucose out of your liver. So you'll need to cover that with a bit of insulin. If there is a huge amount of protein in there, for example, if one chicken breast is enough to cover the needs for growth and repair, if you have 2 chicken breasts, the second chicken breast is not needed for growth and repair. The liver, over a period of 3 to 5 hours after eating, will convert that protein into glucose and put it into the bloodstream. So you'll need some insulin hanging around for there. And if the meal's really high in fat, there'll be a bit of insulin resistance. So here's the evidence from a study. So this was on kids who, they came in, I can't quite remember the details exactly, but when I say it's about 30 kids, and on the first day, they gave them nothing to eat just to see what happened to their glucose levels for 4 hours after eating. And you can see in the black line, they stayed pretty steady. They dropped by 1 millimole or half a millimole, suggesting the basal rate was about right. And then the second day, with the same basal rates, the same people, they gave them a meal that was only 2.5 grams carbs, but a good lug of protein at 30 grams and a good lug of fat at 50 grams. And again, you can see nothing happened for the first 45 minutes as that fat was slowing down the digestion. But as that protein and that glucagon took effect from the protein and the extra protein being turned into glucose, as well as the insulin resistance from the fat, you can see the glucose level rose by sort of 3, 4, 5 millimoles afterwards. So what we need is insulin start to kick in about 30 to 40 minutes after eating and to sort of cover this if you're going to go low carb. One thing to say is if you are going low carb, the same rules apply. Would your grandmother recognize the diet that you're on a low carb? Are you a low carber who's eating lots of non-starchy vegetables, things like olives, olive oil, and some nice fresh meats? Or are you a low carber who's eating pepperami, processed cheese, whey protein balls, and all these things that your grandma wouldn't recognize? The same principles still apply. Healthy eating is healthy eating, whether you're low carb or high carb. This is an example of what you could do. So Jim is eating some steak with green leafy vegetables and olive oil and hummus, 40 grams of protein, 10 grams of carbs, 30 grams of fat. You would obviously cover the 10 grams of carbs with your ratio. So if it's a 1 to 10, you can see here that would be 1 unit for that. 40 grams of protein, divide it by 4, and then use your ratio, so that would be 1 unit. So it's 2 units overall. If you was on a pump, you would deliver an extended wave over an hour, so the insulin starts to really kick in half an hour in. Or if you're on injections, you would give the insulin after eating, which would be typically half an hour after you're eating. It takes about 15 to 20 minutes to kick in. Therefore, the insulin's arriving at the right time. It's somewhere to start. It's a method for you to consider. It will require some adjustment. Some people need to divide the protein by 2 rather than 4, but you would need to work that out over time. Whether a low carb diet is a good idea or a bad idea for a young person, I think we'll probably discuss in the questions, because if I'm a predictor, someone's definitely put that in the questions. So we'll cover that at the end. But in terms of how do you dose that type of meal, This is the sort of results you can achieve by making sure you're giving the insulin after eating. It matches the glucose appearance much more effectively. Okay, so we've talked about how to dose for balanced meals, high carb meals, high fat meals, and now low carb meals. So depending, you need to know what type of meal you're eating, but if you do, you've now got a strategy you can use for each one of those. And what I would say is, if you want to attack the post-meal spike, and I know Gary Shiner did a session on this yesterday, so I'm sure there's some tips and tricks from there too. But the first thing is think about your meal structure. If you have 3 balanced meals with 3 doses of insulin, 3 to 4 hours apart every day, you're pretty much going to have in target glucose levels because you're matching the insulin and the food lovely, and it's going to make it there. I know I've got young kids, that's not always possible. So there might be a couple of higher carb snacks that sneak in. But if your structure is still good at 3 balanced meals with maybe 1 snack, you might only get a few spikes here and there. But if you're having the traditional normal, what's now normal in society, to have Cocoa Pops for breakfast, white bread for lunch, snacks are chocolate bar, evening meal is chicken nuggets and chips, well, you're going to be down here on the high carb going in all the time. It doesn't matter what insulin regime you're on, you're not going to match the glucose appearance. You're going to find diabetes an enormous struggle to manage. So first of all, if you can get your meal structure in place, it really makes it easy. Insulin tactics we've discussed, get your insulin in 20 minutes before. Something I discussed yesterday, your quick acting insulin, you need to have that into either your belly or the back of your arm. The reason being is the blood flow to there is much more effective. So the insulin absorption is much faster. And this is just a study from showing the same insulin dose in the same people, giving in the thigh, it only peaks nowhere near as high after an hour, and it lasts longer and is spread out. So that doesn't match how the glucose is absorbed. You have it in the upper arm, much better. You have it in the abdomen, even better. So if you're on injections, keep your long-acting insulin to your leg or on your bum and keep your quick-acting to your belly and your arm. You will notice a huge difference. If you're on an insulin pump, it's really difficult if you one day have the cannula in your belly and then the next day have the cannula in your leg, because you're going to be getting different levels of absorption. So my advice is try and stick to the abdomen because you're going to get best absorption. But if you're switching between the two and you're wondering why things are unpredictable, that could be a reason why. Bottom one is to show, make sure you check for your lumpy areas. The insulin effectiveness from a lumpy area is not very good. So you get high glucose levels if you get it in a nice fresh area. So obviously just make sure you check your skin that you don't have any lumps and bumps. In terms of activity for me comes in 2 ways of how you can help manage your glucose levels. The first one is you need consistency in how active you are. So if on the school days, your young person is very active, you'll notice their insulin requirements are lower because when you're active, a side door to your cells opens up to allow glucose to flow in. So your insulin requirements are lower and generally the glucose levels are lower. If on the weekend, the same young person is a computer warrior and does nothing but this all day, staring at the screen and is not active, you don't get this side door to the cells opening. Therefore, you need more insulin and the glucose levels go higher. So the best thing you can do is achieve consistency in activity. And the suggestion is 60 minutes of activity each day. So if they get that at school easily, you've got no worries. But on the weekend, you might need to proactively encourage 60 minutes worth of activity so the insulin requirements stay the same. You can overcome that if you change the background insulin dose either on injections or pump by having a basal profile, but it's much more tricky to manage. It's just easier to get consistency in glucose levels. What I mentioned before about using activity to increase the speed of insulin is shown in this graphic on the bottom. If you had breakfast this morning at 8 o'clock and then you got down to watch all this conference and you sat on your backside, you can see the blood flow to your muscles is very, very slow. Therefore, the insulin delivery to your muscles is very slow, and therefore pulling the glucose out of your blood into your cells is very, very slow. If you do 10 minutes of activity, it doesn't have to be playing football. It can be going for a walk. It can be, I do baby Zumba with my daughter sometimes. 10 minutes of activity means that the blood flows to your muscles faster. It delivers insulin faster. It moves glucose faster out of your blood. So my golden rule for myself personally is 10 minutes of activity after each meal, and the same for the people that I work with. So yeah, that's just sort of some tips. So these are all in the infographics you can get from the Google Drive. Obviously, I want to show you in the next slide is my last 14 days of glucose profiles. And this is not just to show off, but it's to show that someone who knows what they're doing, understands the science, puts it into practice, can get away with eating 250 grams of carbs a day and still maintain glucose profile between 3.5 and 8 millimoles at 92% with virtually no spikes over. And that's because I eat 3 balanced meals a day. I do 10 minutes of activity after eating. And if I do have a high fat meal, then I make sure I cover it with all the extra insulin. Very rarely eat processed foods. And if I do, you better believe that I'll be giving the insulin dose and doing 10 or 15 minutes activity after eating. So if someone brings those nice, tasty biscuits and crisps at work, people will laugh at me, but I'll eat them and I'll give the insulin, but then I'll be doing 10 or 15 minutes of high knees in the office to make sure the insulin's working quick enough to bring them down. Now, you might not want to go to those levels to manage your glucose. That is absolutely fine. These are just all options for you to consider. They're like a buffet of options of things that you might feel are useful for you that you could try, but you certainly don't have to feel bad for not doing them. This is just me showing you someone who does them all. You can almost get near normal glucose profile, but it does require some work. So what I'm hoping, we'll get some questions in a minute, you might consider to ask the question, would my grandmother recognize the food that I'm eating and that I'm giving to my young person? Second of all, am I asking my young person to do something that I wouldn't do personally? What are my eating habits looking like? Am I really role modeling what I want this young person to do in terms for their health and their diabetes management? And then number 3, go and take a look in your fridge and your cupboards after this talk and ask yourself the honest question. Am I making it easy for myself and my young person to eat more balanced nutrition and match their insulin to it? And a lot of people are probably going, well, if I take the crisps out, if I take this out, my young person is going to kick off. It's going to be a nightmare. Human beings adapt very, very quickly. How quickly did we adapt to lockdown? How quickly have we adapted to everything? Yes, you will get an unhappy person for a week or two until it becomes a new normal. Once it becomes a new normal, you will realize that actually it just becomes the things go away a little bit. So they're just some questions for you to consider. So that's it from me. Just to show you on the Google Drive, if you click on it, which should be in the chat, what you will have, you'll have a file, and there's the one that I did the other day on the CGM. There's a bit on exercise, a bit on some meal plans, but the insulin dosing guide. There is this, what we've been through today. There's the simple infographics, so you can have those at a glance. And then also, if you're a total nerd like me, all the evidence that's behind this, there's a 150-page document in there that talks about everything from high carb to low carb to insulin dosing. If you really want to get granular with it, it's in there, but it's not for the faint-hearted. So I'll leave that for whoever fancies it. So thank you for your time and attention. And we've got about 6 or 7 minutes for some questions, I think.
Fantastic. John, thank you so much. I have to say, I always take away things from your talk. In particular for me, I find my son, we have to give him for pizza 60-40, and I do it over 4 hours. Okay. And I'd say 9 times out of 10, probably more than that, after 4, 5, 6 hours, I'm having to do a correction. Yeah. And to my mind, because, even if I had weighed out and I hadn't appreciated that the actual need for insulin goes up with the high fat content. So now that's going to give me so much more confidence to actually say, okay, I know I need to do it maybe over a longer period and add more. So thank you very much.
I think that's a typical, not a mistake, because it's absolutely correct that you need to slow the insulin down because of the high fat level. But what hasn't been taught by the diabetes professionals, including myself up until about 3 or 4 years ago, was you need to go bigger. You need to put an extra 25% as the minimum, probably 50.
Yeah. So thank you very much. We have got some other questions come through as well. Yep. One from Paul. With a pump, how can we use basal and bolus to adjust to food most effectively?
Not much different from multiple day injections, really. Get the insulin 20 minutes before. One extra advantage you do have with a pump, and on the Google Drive there's a booklet about this, is for high carb meals or things that get absorbed super quick, you can do something called a super bolus, which is essentially 20 minutes before eating, you put a temporary basal on of 0%. So you're missing 2 hours worth of basal. I'm going to make it really easy and pretend this is me, and my basal's set at 1 unit per hour. So I'm missing 2 units of insulin. Then as I bolus for my meal, I add that 2 units of insulin onto my meal bolus. Therefore, I'm shifting the insulin curve. It works more aggressively in the first 30 to 40 minutes, and you capture a lot more of that glucose rise. So if you're on a pump, you can do that super bolus, and that will help the higher levels after high carb meals. It's something that unfortunately you can't do on injections. If you're on injections and you're gonna have that type of meal, you better get your backside moving for 10 minutes after eating if you want to keep that glucose under control.
Fantastic, thank you. We have from Caroline, why does the method of cooking affect the GI, e.g. potatoes?
Yep. So it's basically the same idea of processing. The more you process a food, the more you already pre-digest it and break it down. So mashed potato compared to new potatoes still got the skin. It's still a whole potato. Mashed potato, you've already done half the work for the stomach. You've already broken it down. So once it gets in there, the glucose is there very quickly. So generally, the more you break it down, the more you cook it, the quicker it gets absorbed. And that's the reason why, because you're effectively pre-digesting.
Fantastic, thank you. Sarah from Bucks, her son, 9 years old, diagnosed since 5, has a piece of 50-50 toast with honey, milk and an egg for breakfast. He has an injection between 15 to 30 minutes before breakfast. He still has a spike. Normally he reaches 15. Should she consider a no-carb breakfast?
First of all, if he likes that breakfast and that's what he wants, then that's his choice. What you could do is maybe get rid of some of the honey and add another egg on. That would slow things down. The other thing, if he wants that breakfast and he wants to control the spike, it means he's got to move for 10 or 15 minutes after eating. Those would be the first 2 things to try, and I can guarantee the activity will work. You've got fast movers of glucose and slow movers of glucose. The slow mover of glucose is insulin. It takes 90 minutes to kick in and it takes 4 hours to work. Exercise works within 10 or 15 minutes. So, use that activity for you there. If you still have a really huge problem with post-breakfast spikes, cutting the carbs down and putting more fat and protein in is a thing. So when people come to me and they'll say, oh, I have banana on toast in the morning, I have a real problem. It's pretty simple. It's just egg on toast. It makes a huge difference because the fat and the protein slow things down.
Fantastic. I remember from a previous talk that you did, you mentioned that about maybe having Greek yogurt or something. So something I do with Hugo, he'll have a similar breakfast to that, but he'll have some Greek yogurt with fruit. And we find that really does work as well.
And if you can, with those type of things, try and eat the fat and the protein bit first and the carb bit second, if it's possible. And that way, then, if you had the Greek yogurt, for example, go the Greek yogurt first and then put the other stuff in afterwards, because then you've got the fat at the bottom of the stomach slowing things down.
Oh, another handy tip. Thank you. What about cannula placed in the buttocks for insulin absorption? How does that affect it?
Same as the thigh. It's not particularly, it's just slower than the abdomen and the arm. So it's not that it's a bad thing to do. And if it's what you do all the time because your young person has got no fat on the belly or anything like that, obviously use your buttocks. I'm not saying it's a bad thing to do. It's worse if you chop and change. One day the abdomen, one day the buttocks, because the absorption speed changes quite a bit. So it means that you can't get a strategy right, because one day it works fine, and then the next time you change the cannula, it doesn't work, and you think, well, what am I doing wrong? And it's just because of the insulin absorption. But if you're always keeping it in the bum, what you'll probably find is instead of giving insulin 15-20 minutes before, you might need to even give it 25 minutes before, because the absorption's a bit slower.
Fantastic. So like you say, if you keep it in the same spot, you get used to it. You know what works for you.
Correct, yeah.
Otherwise it will get confusing. Rosanna has said, we say, and I feel your pain, Rosanna, I think as every parent does, we say occasional treats are okay, but occasional becomes more often. What is reasonable?
It's a good question. So, and this is where I come back to normal versus natural. So what is normal now is to have at least 2 treats a day. So you have a treat in the mid-morning, which is a packet of crisps. You maybe have a treat in the afternoon, which might be a couple of biscuits. And then before bed, all right, then go on, have another something. So that's 3 treats in one day. For my money, that's way too much. Like, as a baseline, as absolute maximum, I would say 1 treat a day would be where you're looking at. If you came and lived in my house and that's my kids, it's like 1 treat a week. But that's normal for them because they have lived with that since they were a kid. They don't know any different. And I think that's where it's really difficult in today's society, because normal is so far away from what the human body has evolved from, that you feel like I possibly feel it sometimes with my kids. Oh my God, am I making, they are not normal. They're not normal because they're not eating in a normal way. But is that a good or a bad thing? I personally would argue that it's a good thing, because there's probably only about a 3 to 4% chance of my kids being overweight and having metabolic problems. Whereas if they eat normally, there's a 50% chance they're going to be overweight and have a high chance of metabolic problems. So I guess as a parent, you've got to ask yourself that question. Do I sacrifice a bit of normality for natural and healthier, or am I happier with the more normal and they're not as, they don't perceive they're being left out? And I can't make that choice for anyone. You've got to let them know what you're comfortable with. But what I would hope by this talk, at least it's put it into your thought process to allow you to make a decision, because I think most people just get dragged along with what's normal and they don't think anything different. What I would like you to think of, if I'm going to go along with normal, that's my choice and that's fine. And don't let anyone tell you that's a bad thing, because it's a conscious choice. Whereas if you didn't know that and you just go along because that's what your family's always done and that's what your friends do, then it's not really a choice, because you're just doing what everybody else does. But like I say, normal and natural. Would your grandmother recognize it as food? It's a pretty good barometer as to, is it going to be good for the human body or is it not?
I think I had a slightly abnormal grandmother, because she used to have platefuls of white bread with butter on the table with every meal.
You might need to go further back, the great-great-grandma.
Yeah, I think so. Right, I'm aware that we're a minute over time, so we've just got a last couple of questions. I've heard, Paul says, good question, I've heard that reheating pasta changes the GI. Is this true?
Yeah, it does. It makes it lower GI. So when you cook the pasta and it cools, when it cools, it goes from being very easily absorbed to these kind of meshed networks of carbs. And then they're what called resistant starch. So when they get eaten for the second time and reheated, they're not as easily broken down. Be a little bit careful on the carb count in front with those numbers, because the carb that get digested will not be as high as the first time. So you might need to take 10 or 20% off the carb value. Otherwise, you're going to go low.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Lastly, Faye, for a tween who grabs crisp cereal bars or biscuits, what snacks can you recommend? He won't eat cheese, egg, much veg, or peanut butter.
Okay, the first thing will be your food environment. If those options are available, I would eat those all day. If there's chocolate in my cupboard, it does not last 5 minutes. So the first thing is, if those things are available, you've got no chance, because he's always going to know they're there and he's going to have them. So if you're going to be serious about it, you've got to get those things out of the cupboards and then replace them. And what you will find is, once those things are not available and people are hungry, you'd be amazed at what they would eat. Because all of a sudden, if there's no other option and it's either cheese or it's nuts or whatever, your choice between eating or going hungry, all of a sudden there's no longer three choices. There's no longer tasty crisps and biscuits, healthy nuts, or nothing. I'll take the biscuits. Oh, now there's no that. It's either be hungry or nuts or whatever else. Well, maybe I'll just start it. I'll begrudgingly try it. And all of a sudden that becomes normal. So I'm not going to pretend that it's easy. And I don't think that it is easy. But is it worth doing? For my opinion, for my kids, yes. But you need to have that thought process for yourself. So yeah, I can't answer that easily. And it's the conversation I have with parents that I work with all the time. Are you willing to undergo the hard yards for 2 weeks to change your eating habits to make a lifetime of difference? Your choice. I'm not preaching. I'm not saying everyone should do something. I'm telling you what I do and giving you some options.
Faye, another thing I do for my teens, I think speed is of the essence. When they come home from school and they're starving, if I have put on the table some cut up fruits and cut up veg and dips, and it's on the table when they come home, they will just absorb it and eat that. If they haven't got there in time, they'll go straight to the snack cupboard and they'll be eating the other stuff. So, and more times than not, they'll clear the whole table of my snacks and then go and take something else anyway. But anyway, right, quickly, we've got, is it true freezing foods changes GI?
I genuinely don't know the answer to that question. I should imagine along the same principle, not so much the freezing, but more if you've cooked it the first time and then when it's cooled down, it's the cooling process where it kind of comes together and forms this resistant starch. So it's on the same principle as cooling pasta and reheating.
Great. Okay. Right. I'm just getting loads and loads of thanks. I did just see one question pop up into the, is it better method? Oh, hang on. Yeah, I thought there was another question in the chat, but I can't see it now. I think we're going to have to move on. Thank you so much, John.
No
that was amazing. I've written down some notes, and you're certainly going to help with our management now. So thank you ever so much.
All right, lovely. Have a good rest of the conference, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.